For more than 30 years, Johnny Carson welcomed America's biggest stars onto The Tonight Show, offering them a national stage to charm audiences and carefully reshape their public image. But beneath the laughter and polished anecdotes, often lingered something far more volatile: scandals that had already ignited headlines, ended marriages, and sparked moral outrage. There was a time when falling in love could trigger condemnation from the Vatican, denunciation from the United States Senate, and relentless attacks from the press. When women were branded home wreckers or moral threats, while the men involved continued their careers with little consequence. From the explosive affair between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, which helped shatter the old studio publicity system, to the exile of Ingrid Bergman after her pregnancy scandal, these were not just celebrity stories, they were cultural battlegrounds. The media profited, public judgment intensified, and female desire became a spectacle. Yet, when these women appeared on Carson's couch, something shifted. Carson had the rare ability to acknowledge scandal without humiliating his guests, giving them space to reclaim narratives that tabloids had torn apart. During an era shaped by the sexual revolution and second-wave feminism, his stage became a quiet arena where America renegotiated its views on marriage, fidelity, and female autonomy. In the coming minutes, we will revisit 8 women whose romantic entanglements once shocked the nation. But what we will truly witness is not just scandal, it is the evolution of morality itself, unfolding live on national television. When Ali MacGraw sat across from Johnny Carson in the mid-1970s, the air carried more than polite late-night conversation. Just a few years earlier, she had been America's sweetheart, the luminous breakout star of Love Story in 1970, a film whose famous line, "Love means never having to say you're sorry," would take on an almost ironic resonance in her own life. Her image had been carefully constructed: intelligent beauty, natural charm, modern femininity, without the artificial gloss of the old studio glamour. Her marriage to Paramount powerhouse producer Robert Evans seemed like the perfect Hollywood union: beauty and power, youth and influence, the new royalty of a changing industry. That image began to fracture in 1972 when MacGraw traveled to Texas to film The Getaway opposite Steve McQueen, then one of the most magnetic male stars in the world. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and what began as a professional partnership quickly ignited into one of Hollywood's most publicized affairs. This was not merely a private romance, it was a collision of archetypes. Evans represented studio authority and strategic power, while McQueen embodied raw masculinity and rebellious charisma. Caught between them, MacGraw's choice to leave Evans and later marry McQueen in 1973 was framed by the press not as a woman following her heart, but as a betrayal of power itself. The tabloids wasted no time. Headlines painted her as reckless, impulsive, ungrateful to the husband who had made her career. Rarely did they scrutinize McQueen with the same moral intensity. His history of infidelity was absorbed into the mythology of the tortured alpha male. Hers became evidence of feminine instability. In a media ecosystem increasingly driven by scandal, one no longer fully controlled by studio publicists, MacGraw became profitable controversy. Was she choosing love over strategy? Or was she simply stepping out of a structure where her identity had been tethered to powerful men? When she appeared on Carson's couch after the storm had broken, the scandal hovered in the room even when unspoken. Carson, true to form, did not interrogate her choices. Instead, he treated her as a working actress with agency, focusing on her craft and current projects rather than reducing her to the woman who left Robert Evans for Steve McQueen. Yet beneath her composure, viewers could sense the tension of someone renegotiating her public identity in real time. Over the years, as her marriage to McQueen deteriorated, reportedly strained by his jealousy and controlling behavior, her subsequent Carson appearances revealed subtle evolution. The defensiveness softened, reflection replaced justification. The woman once defined by the men in her life began speaking more openly about independence and self-definition. MacGraw's arc mirrored something larger unfolding in America during the 1970s, as second-wave feminism challenged traditional expectations of marriage and female loyalty. Her story became more than celebrity gossip. It became a case study in how quickly admiration could turn into moral judgment when a woman disrupted established power structures. In retrospect, her time on Carson's stage feels less like damage control and more like quiet reclamation, a woman insisting that love, however messy, did not make her a villain. When Elizabeth Taylor appeared on Johnny Carson's couch in the 1970s and later in her legendary solo appearance in 1992, she carried with her not merely the aura of a movie star, but the weight of having survived one of the most explosive romantic scandals of the 20th century. By then, the headlines had faded into legend, yet their impact still echoed through Hollywood history. Her affair with Richard Burton during the filming of Cleopatra in 1962 had not simply ended marriages. It had detonated the very machinery that once protected stars from public scrutiny. Before Taylor and Burton, the studio publicity system functioned as a shield. Publicists, fixers, and carefully curated press relationships ensured that indiscretions remained whispers rather than headlines. But the production of Cleopatra was already drowning in excess ballooning budgets, international media attention, illness, delays, and when Taylor and Burton's affair ignited, it proved impossible to contain. The world watched as two married stars fell passionately in love in full public view. Taylor was married to singer Eddie Fisher, who himself had left America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds to be with her only a few years earlier. Burton was married to Sybil Williams. The narrative quickly crystallized into moral theater, betrayal, lust, spectacle. The backlash was swift and ferocious. The Vatican publicly condemned Taylor, accusing her of erotic vagrancy. A United States Senator, Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado, denounced her on the Senate floor as a corrupting influence. Calls for boycotts spread. Mainstream publications framed her not as a woman in love, but as a destabilizing force, a home wrecker, a symbol of moral decay. Yet Burton, though criticized, was rarely subjected to the same intensity of moral condemnation. His passion was romanticized. Hers was pathologized. Why did love make him magnetic but make her dangerous? The press profited enormously. Circulation numbers soared as tabloids chronicled every detail of their affair. The collapse of the old studio control system meant that scandal itself became currency. Private passion was transformed into global entertainment, and Taylor stood at the center of a media storm that permanently altered how celebrity lives would be covered. In many ways, the Taylor-Burton affair ushered in the modern era of celebrity culture, where privacy was no longer protected but monetized. And yet, when Taylor sat across from Carson, something remarkable occurred. There was no sermon, no interrogation. Carson treated her not as a fallen woman seeking redemption, but as a legend who had lived boldly and survived the consequences. He acknowledged the scale of her life without reducing it to scandal. By the time of her later appearances, Taylor had already transformed herself once again, this time into a pioneering humanitarian, particularly in her groundbreaking advocacy for AIDS research at a moment when many public figures remained silent. The woman once denounced as morally corrupt had become a figure of compassion and courage. Her arc represents more than personal redemption. It reflects cultural evolution. In 1962, she was condemned as a threat to public morality. By the 1970s and beyond, she was celebrated as a woman who had lived unapologetically. Time did not erase the scandal, but it reframed it. Watching her on Carson's stage, poised and unashamed, one sees not a villain of tabloid mythology, but a woman who refused to let public condemnation define her. If love once made her a symbol of national anxiety, survival made her something far more enduring, a force that helped reshape the boundaries of celebrity, sexuality, and autonomy itself. When Joan Collins took her seat beside Johnny Carson throughout the 1970s and 1980s, she brought with her something radically different from quiet regret or carefully managed contrition. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Collins did not shrink from discussions of her romantic history, nor did she frame her extramarital affairs as shameful lapses in judgment. She spoke with composure, wit, and an unmistakable sense of ownership over her choices, an attitude that both unsettled and fascinated American audiences. Her relationships, including well-publicized affairs during her marriages, Among them, a rumored involvement with Ryan O'Neal had already circulated widely through tabloids, eager to portray her as a man-eater. The label was familiar, almost ritualistic in its application to women who refused to apologize for desire. Yet Collins dismantled it not with defensiveness, but with charm. She suggested, sometimes with a raised eyebrow and a mischievous smile, that if a husband failed to provide emotional or romantic fulfillment, she felt no obligation to remain quietly dissatisfied. The implication was clear. Fidelity, in her view, was not a sacred performance demanded by society, but a mutual arrangement dependent on reciprocity. This perspective clashed sharply with the expectations placed upon female stars of her generation. While male actors had long been allowed to hint at their romantic escapades as evidence of virility and charisma, women were expected to either deny, regret, or spiritually repent. Collins chose a different route. She did not deny complexity, nor did she glorify pain, but she refused to accept the moral script written for her. Was the scandal in the affairs themselves, or in the fact that she declined to feel ashamed? Carson's approach was telling. He engaged her as an equal, curious, amused, occasionally teasing, but never moralizing. The interviews unfolded less like confessions and more like negotiations between two sharp minds aware of the cultural moment. By the late 1970s, America was deep into the aftershocks of the sexual revolution and second-wave feminism. Divorce rates were rising, conversations about female autonomy were expanding, and traditional expectations of marriage were under scrutiny. Collins embodied a European sophistication that seemed to glide past American prudishness, challenging the audience to reconsider the automatic equation between female infidelity and moral collapse. The media, of course, continued to profit from her image. Headlines amplified the sensational aspects of her love life, framing her confidence as predatory. Yet the very consistency of her self-possession gradually reshaped perception. Rather than appearing reckless, she seemed deliberate. Rather than destructive, she appeared self-aware. Watching her over multiple appearances on Carson's stage, one can see evolution not in her morality, but in public tolerance. What once shocked became, if not fully accepted, at least openly discussed. Collins did something subtle but powerful. She normalized the idea that women could narrate their own romantic histories without seeking absolution. She neither begged for forgiveness nor positioned herself as a victim of passion. Instead, she insisted on complexity that desire, dissatisfaction, and choice could coexist without collapsing into villainy. In doing so, she exposed the double standard at the heart of celebrity scandal. If men could be charmingly flawed, why must women be morally condemned? On Carson's couch, under the lights of network television, Joan Collins did not ask for redemption. She claimed authorship. And perhaps that was the most unsettling act of all. When Sybil Shepherd began appearing on Johnny Carson in the 1970s, she was not simply promoting films, she was navigating the aftermath of one of New Hollywood's most uncomfortable romantic scandals. Her relationship with director Peter Bogdanovich had begun during the filming of The Last Picture Show in 1971, while he was still married to his wife and creative collaborator, Polly Platt. The affair did not just end a marriage, it disrupted a powerful artistic partnership that had helped shape the visual and emotional identity of Bogdanovich's early success. Almost overnight, Shepherd, then just 21 years old, was branded by the press as the other woman. The narrative that formed around her was swift and reductive. Rather than examining the complexities of adult relationships or the agency of the director himself, headlines centered on the image of the young beauty who had stolen a husband and derailed a marriage. The language was telling. Words like homewrecker functioned less as description and more as moral verdict. Bogdanovich, meanwhile, was framed as a brilliant artist caught in passion, his choices interpreted through the lens of male romantic intensity rather than ethical failure. Why was she cast as the disruptor, while he remained the auteur? For Shepherd, the label threatened to overshadow her emerging career. She had entered the industry as a former model transitioning into acting, already navigating skepticism about her talent. Now, she faced the additional burden of moral branding. In an era when the sexual revolution was reshaping private lives, but not yet fully dismantling public judgment, the double standard remained intact. The press profited from the drama, amplifying conflict and simplifying complexity into digestible scandal. Yet the deeper story was less about seduction and more about autonomy. Was she a naive young woman caught in a powerful man's orbit, or an active participant in her own romantic decisions? When she appeared on Carson's stage, viewers could sense the tension between public perception and personal identity. Carson, consistent in his approach, did not weaponize the scandal. He treated Shepard as a professional, engaging her humor, intelligence, and ambitions rather than reducing her to a tabloid caricature. Over multiple appearances throughout the 1970s and 1980s, something gradual but significant unfolded. The defensive edge softened, replaced by self-awareness. Shepard began speaking more openly about her experiences, not as confessions but as components of growth. She acknowledged the complexities of her relationships, including later romances, yet framed them within a broader narrative of self-discovery. Her evolution mirrored broader cultural shifts. As feminism gained visibility and conversations about female agency expanded, Shepard's story became emblematic of a generation of women resisting simplistic moral binaries. The young woman, once defined by her association with a married director, emerged as a performer with a substantial career, a mother, and eventually an author capable of recounting her history on her own terms. Watching her progression across Carson's couch feels less like a tale of scandal fading and more like the slow reclamation of narrative control. In retrospect, the question is not merely whether the affair was justified or condemnable, but why her identity was so quickly collapsed into that single episode. If male directors were permitted artistic genius alongside personal indiscretion, why was a young actress expected to carry the weight of moral failure alone? On national television, under Carson's measured gaze, Sybil Shepard did something quietly radical. She expanded beyond the label assigned to her. And in doing so, she reflected a society slowly learning imperfectly, unevenly to separate female desire from automatic condemnation. When Shirley MacLaine appeared on Johnny Carson's couch, something she did dozens of times over the course of his tenure, she did not arrive burdened by a single explosive scandal. Instead, she brought something far more unsettling to conventional America, a philosophical challenge to the very definition of marriage itself. While other women on this list were labeled for affairs conducted in secrecy or scandal, MacLaine openly described an unconventional arrangement with her husband, businessman Steve Parker, that lasted nearly 3 decades. Married in 1954, MacLaine and Parker spent much of their relationship living on different continents, she in the United States pursuing her acting career, he in Japan managing business interests. Rather than disguising extramarital relationships as lapses or moral failures, MacLaine spoke candidly about what she described as a consensual understanding between them. In her view, exclusivity was not the foundation of commitment. Honesty and independence were. This distinction was radical in mid-century America, where monogamy was often presented as the unquestioned core of marital morality. If both partners agreed to freedom, could it still be called betrayal? MacLaine's willingness to articulate this philosophy on network television during the 1960s and 1970s coincided with the broader sexual revolution and the rise of second-wave feminism. Divorce laws were shifting, birth control had transformed reproductive autonomy, and women were increasingly questioning the structures that had defined their lives. Yet mainstream audiences were not uniformly prepared for a married, middle-aged Academy Award-winning actress calmly explaining that possessiveness was neither natural nor necessary. Her perspective did not frame extramarital relationships as scandal. It rejected the language of cheating altogether. The media's reaction oscillated between fascination and suspicion. Headlines hinted at impropriety, yet MacLaine's composed delivery and intellectual grounding made it difficult to reduce her stance to reckless rebellion. She tied her beliefs to spiritual exploration and Eastern philosophies, emphasizing growth, autonomy, and non-attachment rather than indulgence. Carson, notably, did not mock or undermine her ideas. Instead, he engaged with curiosity, allowing her to articulate a worldview that many viewers had likely never encountered. In doing so, he turned his stage into a forum for cultural negotiation rather than moral arbitration. What made MacLaine distinct from others accused of infidelity was that she refused to inhabit the moral frame assigned to them. She did not apologize, nor did she dramatize. She treated her marriage as a conscious partnership between two individuals who prioritized freedom alongside commitment. The longevity of the relationship, nearly 30 years, complicated easy condemnation. If traditional marriages ended in secrecy and resentment, was her alternative model inherently less valid? Watching her interviews now, one sees not scandal but prescience. Contemporary conversations about open relationships, polyamory, and negotiated boundaries echo themes she articulated decades earlier. On Carson's couch, MacLaine was not defending herself against accusation. She was expanding the conversation about love. In a cultural moment, still wrestling with the boundaries of female autonomy, her calm insistence that marriage could be reimagined felt quietly revolutionary. When Judy Garland appeared on Johnny Carson in 1968, just months before her death, the audience did not see the scandal that had once followed her. They saw fragility. She was only 46, yet she looked older, worn down by decades of exhaustion, addiction, financial instability, and emotional turbulence. Carson sensed it immediately. The tone of the interview shifted. There was no probing, no attempt to stir controversy. Instead, there was gentleness, protection. But long before that final appearance, Garland's romantic life had already generated its own storms. Her affair with Sid Luft began while she was still married to director Vincente Minnelli in the late 1940s. The relationship was not merely whispered about. It became unavoidable when Garland became pregnant with Luft's child before her divorce was finalized. In post-war America, where domestic ideals were tightly reinforced, such circumstances carried moral weight. The press framed the situation as reckless and destabilizing, yet rarely examined the deeper instability that had shaped Garland's life since childhood. Garland had entered Hollywood as a teenager under the rigid control of the studio system, where her body, diet, and even sleep were regulated. Stimulants and sedatives were introduced early to sustain punishing schedules. Emotional vulnerability was treated as inconvenience. By the time her marriage to Minnelli deteriorated, she was not merely a woman seeking passion, she was someone searching desperately for stability, protection, and partnership. Luft appeared to offer that. He was pragmatic, hands-on, and actively involved in managing her career. Was the affair an act of rebellion, or a plea for security in a life built on performance? Their subsequent marriage lasted 13 years, her longest, yet it too was marked by conflict, financial strain, gambling issues, and mutual infidelities. The tabloids chronicled each rupture, often reducing Garland's complexity to instability. Yet, when she sat beside Carson in 1968, none of that history was weaponized. Carson recognized something more urgent than scandal. He guided the conversation towards safe ground, allowing her humor and musical memory to surface without forcing her to relive public wounds. His approach revealed a crucial distinction. With guests who projected control and confidence, he engaged openly with controversy. With Garland, visibly fragile, he became protective. The absence of sensationalism spoke volumes. It acknowledged that behind headlines about affairs and broken marriages stood a woman who had been consumed by an industry long before she was ever accused of consuming love unwisely. Watching that final appearance now is almost unbearable. The laughter feels brittle, the applause tinged with foreboding. Within months, Garland would be gone. The scandals that once defined her fade beside the image of a human being struggling to remain upright under the weight of history. Her affair with Luft, once treated as moral misstep, reads differently in hindsight, less as betrayal, more as part of an ongoing search for grounding in a life that had rarely offered it. If earlier stories on this list illustrate cultural double standards, Garland's story reveals something deeper: the cost of survival. On Carson's stage, there was no public trial, no moral reckoning. There was only a quiet acknowledgement that some scandals are symptoms, not crimes. And sometimes, the most humane act a host can offer is not interrogation, but grace. When Ingrid Bergman appeared on Johnny Carson in the 1970s, the applause carried a weight history could not ignore. Decades earlier, she had not merely been criticized, she had been publicly condemned at the highest level of American government. Her affair with Italian director Roberto Rossellini in 1949 did not unfold quietly. It detonated across continents. At the time, Bergman was married to Swedish physician Petter Lindström and was widely regarded as the embodiment of wholesome cinematic virtue. She was the luminous face of Casablanca, the moral center of wartime romance, the star whose on-screen purity had fused with her off-screen image. When she wrote to Rossellini expressing admiration for his neorealist films and soon after traveled to Italy to work with him, ultimately becoming pregnant before her divorce was finalized, the American public reacted as though a national symbol had collapsed. The backlash escalated rapidly. In 1950, United States Senator Edwin C. Johnson denounced her on the Senate floor as a powerful influence for evil. Religious organizations condemned her. Theaters boycotted her films. The press transformed a personal romantic decision into a moral referendum on female virtue. She was not merely labeled unfaithful, she was declared unworthy of America itself. Why did her choice provoke exile? While male stars engaged in affairs without legislative rebuke, Bergman left Hollywood and built a career in Europe with Rossellini. Their artistic collaborations, though not all commercially successful, became foundational works in post-war cinema. Yet the marriage was turbulent, marked by intense personalities and eventual infidelities on both sides. By 1957, their union had dissolved. What remained was the question of return. Could America forgive what it had once treated as cultural betrayal? When Bergman returned to Hollywood and later appeared on Carson's program, the cultural temperature had shifted. The sexual revolution was underway. Divorce rates were rising. The moral absolutism of the 1950s had softened. Carson did not interrogate her as a symbol of past scandal. Instead, he welcomed her as a legend whose talent had endured beyond controversy. There was respect in his tone and perhaps subtle acknowledgement that history had judged her too harshly. Her arc from condemnation to celebration illustrates how scandal is often less about the act itself than about timing. In 1949, female desire expressed outside sanctioned boundaries threatened social order. By the 1970s, that same desire could be reframed as autonomy. Watching Bergman on Carson's stage feels like witnessing national amnesia, or perhaps national evolution. The woman once described as morally corrupt stood calmly before an audience that now applauded her resilience. Bergman's story complicates the idea of redemption. She did not beg for forgiveness. She continued working, continued living, and allowed time to recalibrate perception. On Carson's couch, there was no sense of apology tour. There was dignity, and perhaps the most striking revelation of all was this: exile did not destroy her, it enlarged her. The scandal that once expelled her from Hollywood ultimately became a chapter in a far greater legacy. When Ava Gardner appeared on Johnny Carson, she did not carry the air of apology that often accompanied women entangled in scandal. She carried something more dangerous: indifference to judgment. By the time she sat beneath Carson's studio lights, the mythology around her was already carved into Hollywood legend. 3 marriages, numerous affairs, and a romance with Frank Sinatra that had shaken the industry to its core. Gardner had married actor Mickey Rooney in 1942, then bandleader Artie Shaw in 1945. Both marriages ended quickly, feeding early narratives that she was too wild to contain. But it was her relationship with Sinatra in the late 1940s that transformed gossip into national spectacle. At the time, Sinatra was married to Nancy Sinatra and struggling professionally. His career was faltering. His public image was fraying. When his affair with Gardner became public in 1949, the press framed the story not as a mutual passion between two powerful adults, but as seduction and ruin. Sinatra was portrayed as a man undone by obsession. Gardner was cast as the temptress, the dangerous beauty who lured him away from domestic stability and into emotional chaos. The narrative hardened quickly. His decline was her fault. His instability was her influence. Why was a grown man's unraveling attributed to the magnetism of a woman rather than his own choices? The language used to describe her revealed more about cultural anxiety than about Gardner herself. She was famously dubbed the most beautiful animal in the world, a phrase that elevated and dehumanized her simultaneously. Beauty became instinct. Instinct became threat. Hollywood's studio system both marketed and feared that power. MGM understood that her sensuality sold tickets, yet the same sensuality was framed as morally destabilizing once it extended beyond controlled publicity. Gardner never pretended to be domesticated. She drank openly, spoke candidly, and refused to perform innocence. Her marriage to Sinatra in 1951 was passionate and volatile, marked by jealousy, separations, reconciliations, and public spectacle. They divorced in 1957, but the mythology endured. She had been the storm that nearly destroyed him. Lost in that simplification was a more complex reality. Gardner herself endured miscarriages, career pressures, and the relentless scrutiny of a press eager to reduce her to appetite. When she appeared on Carson's stage, there was no melodramatic defense. She did not seek absolution. Carson engaged her with respect, even admiration, recognizing the intelligence beneath the legend. Their exchanges carried subtle tension not of accusation, but of awareness. Both understood the myth surrounding her. Yet she refused to dismantle it for comfort. She neither confirmed nor denied in ways that satisfied moral curiosity. She existed unapologetically. Ava Gardner's story crystallizes the deepest thread running through this entire series. Ally McGraw was condemned for choosing passion over power. Elizabeth Taylor was denounced by senators and religious authorities. Ingrid Bergman was exiled. Judy Garland was pitied. Shirley MacLaine redefined marriage. Joan Collins rejected shame. Sybil Shepherd reclaimed narrative control, but Gardner stands at the rawest edge of it all, the woman blamed for a man's collapse. Her life forces a final question. Was the scandal her behavior, or society's inability to tolerate female desire uncontained by gratitude or remorse? On Carson's couch, beneath the polished veneer of late-night television, Ava Gardner embodied something Hollywood could exploit but never fully control. She did not fall from grace, she refused to chase it. And perhaps that was the true transgression. Across decades of late-night television, beneath the steady glow of studio lights and the calm composure of a seasoned host, something far more revealing unfolded than celebrity small talk. 8 women sat on that couch at different moments in history, each carrying her own scandal, her own headline, her own version of public judgment. Ally McGraw was criticized for choosing passion over power. Elizabeth Taylor was condemned by senators and religious authorities for loving too visibly. Joan Collins refused to apologize for desire. Sybil Shepherd was reduced to the other woman. Shirley MacLaine challenged the very architecture of marriage. Judy Garland was pitied rather than understood. Ingrid Bergman was exiled by a nation. And Ava Gardner was blamed for a man's collapse. Different eras, different contexts, yet the undertone remained hauntingly consistent. When men followed desire, the language softened into romance, rebellion, or tortured genius. When women did the same, the tone hardened into accusation. The difference was rarely the act itself. It was who performed it. Affairs were not new to Hollywood. Broken marriages were not rare. What unsettled the culture was something more disruptive. Women exercising choice without seeking absolution, women leaving security without asking permission, women refusing to collapse beneath shame in order to restore social balance. What makes these moments powerful in hindsight is not merely the scandals, but the stillness of the interviews themselves. Johnny Carson did not turn his stage into a courtroom. He often allowed space instead of verdict, curiosity instead of condemnation. In that space, something subtle happened. The audience saw not headlines, but humans complex, flawed, autonomous. Over time, that visibility began to soften what once felt unforgivable. Culture shifted not through grand declarations, but through repeated exposure to women who survived their own narratives. So the question that lingers is not whether they were right or wrong. It is far more uncomfortable than that. Was love ever the true offense? Or was the greater transgression that these women insisted on defining their own emotional lives, even when those definitions defied public expectation? History judged them loudly. Time complicated the verdict. And now, decades later, their stories no longer feel like cautionary tales. They feel like early tremors of a cultural reckoning that is still unfolding. If love became a crime in their era, perhaps it was not because it was immoral, but because it was autonomous. And autonomy, especially when claimed by women in full view of the public, has always unsettled power more than passion ever could.